Hello everybody and welcome along to the third edition of KerVAM. I nearly said second there, nearly got it wrong. Of course, a brand new Doctor Who podcast where we're discussing all things Doctor Who DVDs, Blu-Rays, the special features, and just basically celebrating the releases of Doctor Who, because, you know, there's so many podcasts out there where you can hear a discussion on a story, but we're here to tell you about the release of that story, about the special features about that story, the documentaries, all those kind of things, because we love them. And I know there are quite a few people out there who really enjoy them, enjoy the collection box sets, all those kind of things, and that's what we are here to discuss. So I'd like to introduce Ryan and Charlie. You guys are back again. How are you doing, guys?
Doing well, thank you. How about you, Charlie?
Yeah, I'm doing fine. I've been watching some classic Who and VAM recently, most notably, obviously, seasons 12 and 19.
Yeah, brilliant. It's certainly what we're going to be covering off today, as you mentioned, Charlie. And as I'm sure many people who are, big fans are aware that today, when this is being released, marks the date of the re-release of the season 12 and 19 Doctor Who, the collection Blu-Ray box sets. That's not a mouthful at all, is it? Because, of course, these were the box sets that were the first ones of the range that was started back in 2018. And so I thought today was a good opportunity to kind of, because this podcast didn't exist back in 2018, so we couldn't discuss season 12 and 19 back then. So I thought it'd be a good opportunity to kind of go back and just discuss what was on those releases, what, if you choose to go and get the re-releases as they come out this week, if you choose to get more. If you've already got them, you have a little reminder of all the great things, because even though these were the first releases on the range, I still think they're absolutely action-packed with lots of different special features. So guys, what were your kind of initial thoughts on season 12 and 19? I guess before we kind of look at the background to it, I don't know, if you think of season 12 and you think of season 19, what kind of strikes you first?
Well, for me, season 12 is just absolutely iconic. It's Tom Baker's first season, and it contained both Ark in Space and Genesis of the Daleks, which were my first Doctor Who's, my gateway into Doctor Who, basically. And so I basically owe all my Doctor Who fandom to those two stories, and that season especially. So, yeah, season 12 is iconic. And I thought season 19 was a pretty solid year to the Peter Davison era, I personally think.
Yeah, I think season 12 is great. Most of the stories are really great. We've got robots in there, which I always had a soft spot for. We got Genesis of the Daleks, Ark in Space, even Sontaran Experiment I quite like. Although I do think it doesn't feel like Tom Baker's era just yet. It still feels a bit like Pertwee as such.
Yeah, I know what you mean. I think it's because you start with a unit story, don't you? And then, you don't really see the TARDIS for the whole season. You've got Harry Sullivan, who you feel is very much a unit sort of character. And even once you get to the start of the following season, you've got a unit story again, albeit not set up in Scotland, but another unit story. I do get that it feels like it takes until after Terror of the Zygons to really feel like the Tom Baker era, I think. But that's probably just because it's coming off the back of 5 years of Terence Dicks and Barry Letts doing it, and kind of Philip Hinchcliffe only starting to get involved in it through season 12. I was going to lean it towards that.
And yeah, it's funny because with Robot, I think Barry Letts and Terence Dicks were still on show running things, and I think they were just sort of there to help Philip Hinchcliffe and Robert Holmes out, and they didn't really sort of took over the series fully until about Ark in Space, really. So I guess that kind of feels why there's still a bit of the Pertweedisms in there at the beginning.
Yeah, exactly. So Charlie, what about season 19 for you? What are your sort of memories of that?
I enjoy season 19. It's probably my favourite Davison season. I generally quite like the era. I think I enjoy it more than the general consensus.
Okay.
But yeah, I've seen every story in it except for Visitation, and overall I've got to say it's a really good season. I especially like Earthshock. I actually recently finished watching that, and I've got to say it's such a good story. I really do enjoy it.
Absolutely. Yeah, 100%. Brilliant. Well, of course, we want to give the main focus, because it's all about the Blu-rays, or the special features for this podcast. So we're going to talk about the collection releases of season 12 and 19. So let's go back to the heady days of 2018, before COVID was a thing, and the world was a simpler place, shall we say, back in early 2018, when in many ways this was kind of an unexpected time for Doctor Who fans, because back in 2013 2014 the DVD range was kind of dying its death, essentially. The people were moving on, like Dan Hall was the sort of head of the range back then, was moving on from doing it because pretty much they'd covered all the stories that existed. So what else was there to release? Like they'd done it all. They'd covered it. Great documentaries, full of special features across the DVD range. I think we finally got the Underwater Menace after, a couple of years of complaints and stuff from fans, albeit without the animation it was supposed to have, and instead a terrible photo recon, which I believe was released sort of late 2015. And that seemed like it, really. Sure, we then had the introduction of the animation range the following year in 2016 with Power of the Daleks in late 2016 and Sharda as well to come. But that certainly didn't, as far as I was concerned, signal any indication that we were suddenly going to start releasing, the whole of Classic Who all over again, but on Blu-ray this time. So I think, that's kind of the background, I think, as a fan around that time was like, these animations are cool. Let's just keep focusing on those. But, they're never really going to do anything else with the rest of the show. There's so many just all the great DVDs. And then suddenly, I think it was something like the 11th of March or something around there, mid-March 2018. And I just remember opening Twitter, I think, and just refreshing and scrolling through. And then suddenly I'm looking at this massive picture of Tom Baker's face on a box set. And the word season 12 underneath it, and I was just kind of slightly shocked, really, that suddenly what is this? What I thought the Doctor Range was done. What's going on? And of course, we suddenly realised that they're releasing the whole of season 12 in one box set with a whole new brand new set of special features. There's a trailer with the behind the sofa features, new documentaries, special effects, the soundtracks, everything. And I think it was such a surprising but thrilling moment. It was one of those, because I certainly think that since then, virtually every single box set has kind of been leaked in some way before it's been announced. I've kind of had some awareness of what season it's going to be or whatever. And even like Power of the Daleks was kind of leaked before it happened as well, as we discussed in the previous podcast. Whereas with this, I do not remember any discussion at all about this happening before it did. I don't remember anybody saying, "Oh, I've heard rumours of they're going to do the whole box sets of the whole seasons of Classic Who." So it was fantastic. I thought it was such a thrilling moment when this was announced. I mean, what do you guys... So, Charlie, Ryan, I've talked for a bit. What do you guys think? Do you remember the day they announced that season 12 and the start of this whole new collection range? And what were your thoughts at the time?
So at the time, I was barely into Doctor Who. I was watching through New Who. It must have been, season 8, season 9 at the time. And I was a bit confused, really, since the whole concept of Classic Who was a bit new to me. I was kind of aware of it. I didn't know it was so extensive. It lasted 26 seasons, though.
Yeah.
And I saw it and I thought, oh, that looks pretty cool. And that's kind of what convinced me to get a couple of the DVDs, and I did. I got Genesis of the Daleks, which I actually have here, and I got the Time Warrior as well for some reason. I don't really know why. I just think it was pretty cool how they did the new special effects over the the old the ones that vary in quality quite a lot. It was just a bit of a surprise, definitely. Ryan, what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, by then I pretty much collected all of the DVD range. I pretty much burnt through all of it, and so I just thought, what else could they possibly put out there except more animation reconstructions? And so I remember opening my emails because I subscribed to the official Doctor website. I remember opening up my emails and suddenly they announced that they were going to re-release them on Blu-ray, and I was just like, what? It was just complete sudden surprise to me, the fact that they were actually going to go back and remaster pretty much every single classic Doctor Who story, starting with pretty much the most iconic Doctor in Tom Baker with season 12. And so when I heard the news, of course I was excited. I just thought, I have to get my hands on this. I really do.
Yeah, exactly. I think it was a very exciting moment as fans, particularly sort of from a personal point of view, because of the sort of age that I was and where my kind of interest in Doctor Who went. I kind of missed all of the DVD range pretty much. Like I wouldn't say I became a fan who was like buying the DVDs until about 2012, 2013 time. And so I kind of felt like I'd missed out on that excitement of, 4 or 5 DVD releases a year for about 10 years and all those new special features and releases and stories to experience and all that kind of thing. I'd kind of missed that. And I was catching up, like, sure, I could buy them in bulk and it was great, but to have that build up and that excitement of these brand new releases, I kind of just had accepted that I'd missed out on that and that I just never get that. And And so from a personal perspective, to then realise actually this is the start of them doing it all over again. But this time I get to go along for the ride. I get to get all of these, enjoy it as they come out, discuss with people about what's going to be on them and what we're hoping for them and all that kind of thing. And, getting on the forums and discussing. It's great. I really enjoy that kind of thing and theorising about what sort of stuff they might be able to bring out and new box sets to come. And just all of that was really, really exciting. So I think that was kind of one of the things I was most excited about, alongside, of course, actually having a whole season in a box set, which I think it seems... In some ways, it was always a kind of obvious thing to do, but they just, for whatever reason, never decided to do it. I think it's weird, isn't it, with classic Doctor Who, because all of the stories in many ways are so individual that, unlike the current series where it's obvious, it's all part of one season, whereas these stories can be so individual that it's almost kind of doesn't make any difference where you kind of pick up within seasons and things. So I think it was quite, in some ways, sort of not surprising, but just interesting that they did ultimately go down the route of putting them all into season box sets. But I think that's also obviously why they're releasing them out of order as well, because it just doesn't really, you don't need to buy them in the right order and watch them all in the right order because of the variety across the different stories and episodes and Doctors, of course, as well, I think. So let's focus first on season 12, of course, because that's where we're starting. We'll cover season 19 later for any Peter Davison fans and whatever. We will come to that. But of course, season 12 was the first one. It was the first release. So I know, Ryan, you've got this release. Were you able to get... Because I know from a lot of fans, this was kind of like gold dust at the time, the original season 12. It was sold out so quickly, and then basically they didn't make enough of them. They didn't realise how many people actually want these box sets, and so there was such a massive shortage of them that, they were going for 400 quid on eBay after release because you just couldn't get hold of it. Were you lucky enough to get hold of it first time round then, Ryan?
Very lucky. I mean, as soon as the pre-orders went up, I pretty much straight up ordered my copy off Amazon, and I knew they were going to be popular, but I didn't realise how popular they were going to become. And so, yeah, later on when I discovered how much they were going to be selling them on eBay and on the Amazon marketplace, I was just like, wow, just wow.
Yeah, 100%. Like I definitely got in and had to pre-order it straight off the bat just to be sure, like I wasn't going to risk missing out on this. And I think it was just a case of the BBC didn't want to take too much of a risk in producing too many of these box sets and then it selling terribly and then making no money on it. But then ultimately, of course, that was the wrong decision. And that's why they then did a re-release of the limited edition last year and are now doing these proper re-releases, which we'll kind of discuss the specifics of a bit later on. But they're fundamentally the same release as the original, just in more simple Blu-ray packaging, essentially. So, of course, the key thing we want to talk about today is those releases, the VAM on them, the new things, the old things, everything in between with the releases. So, Charlie, I want to come to you first because you've focused in this more on the DVD sort of special features and aspects they've got there, because that's more where you're sort of, the things you've got hold of at the moment, essentially. So, kind of, I believe you've had a bit of a look through some of the stories and the VAM on them recently. What would you say for you are kind of some of the highlights from the DVD range in terms of these stories?
Well, my favourite one has got to be this. It's a documentary in Robot called Our Friends Electric, and it's essentially the making of documentary for Robot. But I think it's really interesting how, because it's made a bit later on, and they were just talking about how it was very obvious that it was a Pertwee story, and it talked quite a lot about how I believe they were planning on getting rid of Sarah Jane Smith, but then they didn't because they realised how popular she was with Tom Baker as a fourth Doctor, so they kept them as companion and Doctor until 2 years later. And it's just really interesting insight into the story, into the making of Robots and how similar it was to the Pertwee era.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's so many fascinating making of documentaries across classic Doctor Who DVDs and Blu-rays, where even ones that were made quite a long time ago, there's still some really great ones there with some really interesting insight, because there's so much fascinating sort of information about the behind the scenes of Doctor Who being created, essentially, I think, really. So I do remember having a watch of that one. I do remember it being a thoroughly enjoyable making of, because I think there's lots of great ones. Some of them are a bit kind of box ticking, if that's not a bad way to phrase it. They're kind of like 20 minutes. They're 20 minutes long. They're just a few talking heads. They're telling us how the story was made, but there's not really any particular, creative flair to it, shall we say? And I don't want to be, I'm not being critical to them, but I know it's something that Chris Chapman, one of the main producers on the current Blu-ray range, does lots of documentaries for that. You'll see with the sort of things that he does that he's very much of the kind of wanting to avoid at all costs just doing a talking head documentary, because it's just not quite as interesting and engaging as going out on location and getting them to walk around the location and talk about it, or something along those lines. I think there's so much more that can be added by doing that, really. But yeah, I mean, what other things did you pick up on, Charlie, that you thought were quite interesting to have a look at?
Well, one from one of my all-time favorite stories, Genesis of the Daleks. I don't know a single Whovian who doesn't love this story. It's a documentary called The Dalek Tapes, which isn't a Genesis of the Daleks exclusive. It kind of talks about the entire, like, all of the Dalek stories in classic Who. And it's really interesting just exploring the sort of journey the Daleks took from obviously the original The Daleks in 1964 to Remembrance of the Daleks all the way in 1988. And I just think it's really interesting to see how different like showrunners and like executive producers sort of portrayed them, if you know what I mean. They have very different stories depending on which era they're in.
So Ryan, you had a look at some of the Blu-ray sort of features for these releases. What did you pick up on as some of the more interesting? Well, we'll kind of. I might as well just cover off quickly what are the kind of key new things on the season 12 box set, and then we'll have a little chat about them. Compared to the DVD range, obviously the main thing probably was the introduction of Behind the Sofa. This was the first time they ever did that and gave it a go. Gogglebox Doctor Who, essentially, with cast and crew. Which I think is fundamentally a good, fun idea. It's probably quite a cheap and easy idea, because it's this, you don't really, you do it all in a studio, you do the same thing over and over again, you get them all in for a day to watch the whole stories, or cut down versions of the stories, and I think that probably fills out the Blu-rays somewhat sometimes. Not that I dislike them, I just think that, they're not necessarily my favourite feature to watch, maybe, on some of these Blu-rays. They're just kind of, it's nice to have them, but just kind of okay. And so just quickly, the other features were a new making of documentary for the Centauran experiment, because I don't think it had one at all, actually. I think the original DVD release just had a documentary about all of the Centauran stories, sort of as one, rather than about specifically Centauran experiments. There's a really nice making of that covered on there. I think they took a camera out to the location as well. I can't remember if they took any of the crew there, but I think they took a camera out there and had some stuff from the location. Which is always cool. Always like to cover that off. They did 5.1 audio mixes for Ark in Space and Genesis of the Daleks, which I personally, as a big audio guy, I do that for a degree. Like, I love that stuff. It's brilliant. Even without a 5.1 stereo system, if you stick some headphones on and watch a classic Doctor Who story, and switch between the 5.1 mix and the standard stereo mix, the difference is huge. Like Mark Ayres, who's the sound guy on this, he is brilliant. He's the skills he has to take just a mono audio track of a Doctor Who story from the 1970s, pull it apart and somehow turn it into a 5.1 mix that sounds so much better than it did before. It's just crazy. I'm always amazed by that. So I just find them a much more immersive experience when you add those in. Then we have updated special effects for Revenge of the Cybermen as well, which I think probably could have done with them a little bit, and I think it did actually make an improvement in quite a large way in that as well. Then we also have the Tom Baker in Conversation, sort of hour-long chat with Tom Baker, basically, which was done by Matthew Sweet, and is quite interesting because Matthew Sweet does a great job, I think, of really finding an interesting new angle and new questions to ask that haven't been asked before. I think that's one of the key things he's really, really good at. So that's great. And then they also had a omnibus version of Genesis of the Daleks from the 1970s. They'd recut that and put that back together and had that on the box set, along with an interesting feature, which actually I'll talk about that a bit later. Ryan, I'll let you talk. Tell me about season 12. Tell me about the box set. Tell me about the documentaries. What do you think of it?
Well, I thought they did a really good job. One thing that was a little bit odd was the fact that they removed the Dalek tapes from the Genesis of the Daleks Blu-ray, which I was a bit shocked by. But then the more I thought about it, I thought maybe they might be saving it for either season 2, when the first Dalek story, or
season 1, in fact.
Oh yeah, season 1. Sorry, yeah, got mixed up.
That's okay.
Or season 25, for Remembrance of the Daleks,
that's a
along
good shout.
with the Navroff documentary, and in a way that kind of would be fitting because it's the last classic Dalek story, so they might want to put that documentary in there, which I think might be the right idea. But with the what we did get, I thought the
Yes.
Tom Baker conversation with Matthew Sweet was really insightful. I mean, some of this information I did kind of already know, but it was definitely interesting to hear um, the questions Matthew Sweet was putting forward to Tom Baker, just so getting sort of a perspective of who Tom Baker is and how he approached it, and just sort of what he was like before he took on the role of the
Yeah.
Doctor, how he was a down on his luck actor, trying to make ends meet, working on a building site, and how
Mm.
Doctor Who virtually saved him because he always wanted to be like a hero to everyone, and getting the part of the Doctor was like a dream come true for him. And of course, people responded warmly towards him. I think it's kind of hinted in the conversation about perhaps that was why he stayed on far longer than he should have done, because he loved it and everyone loved it.
Yeah, no, exactly. Yeah, I thought that was a fascinating conversation with him. I think it's just Matthew Sweet's ability to kind of ask questions that haven't been asked before. It's not just, oh, what was it like to work with this, that, and the other. It's like, you know, what we're talking about before he was on Doctor Who and after he was on Doctor Who, which I think is always interesting to explore.
Yeah, definitely, absolutely. And then they had the Tom Baker years, the full
Yes, of
VHS
course. Yes,
thing,
yes.
the full 3 hours of it on the Sunflower Experiment, and that was interesting. I thought, I mean, I had a feeling they were going to do something like this, but I didn't know it was going to be this, and I thought they were probably going to save it for season 18. But
Mm.
in a way, it's just basically Tom Baker in a sort of almost a prototype version of Behind the Sofa, almost, with just
Yeah.
him sitting down watching clips of all of his, from pretty much all of his stories from Robot to Logopolis. And the clips do go on a bit too long, but it's always interesting to hear sort of Tom Baker sort of thoughts about these stories, about what he remembers, what he doesn't remember about them. But
Yeah.
I just thought it was just a really fascinating sort of 3 hour dive into his entire era, basically.
Yeah, exactly. I think it was a classic piece of John Nathan Turner having slightly random ideas of stuff they can do to release about Doctor Who back in the early 90s, I think it was. And obviously this was out on the VHS, and I feel like you get the impression watching it that kind of Tom doesn't really remember half of the stories that he was in. And he's kind of watching these clips. He doesn't really have a clue what's going on. He doesn't really remember it. He's kind of just making it up as he goes along a little bit, which is kind of the charm of it, really, isn't it? I think.
Yeah, and although it's not a bit surprising because of the fact that he's done 7 full
Well, yes.
seasons,
Yeah,
so
exactly.
so many stories. So
Yeah.
I can't hardly blame the man for not remembering
Well,
half of
okay,
the stuff.
that's
in
true.
there.
That's very true. Good point. Yeah, absolutely. Oh dear, yes. So what else, Ryan, have you picked up on from the release?
With Revenge of the Cybermen, while it's quite possibly one of my least favorite classic Who stories, and even though they did try and spruce it up with the brand new special effects in there, I didn't think it did much to save the story for me, because I just not a huge fan of it. And having it come right after Genesis of the Daleks doesn't really do it any favors at all. But what I did find interesting was the documentary, the fact that, and from what I could gather, they did take an existing documentary from the DVD, but just extended it by adding
Yeah,
more new
exactly.
interviews to
Exactly
it.
that. Yeah.
Getting, I believe, Philip Hinchcliffe and Christopher Robbie involved,
Yeah.
talking about their experiences and how almost sort of cursed it was by the fact that they were filming in Wookiees Hall, and the fact that after a practical joke of dressing up this rock as a witch, it led to basically three accidents in a row, pretty much,
Yes.
with a crewman breaking his leg, Liz Sladen almost getting killed in
Yeah.
doing this stunt, and then the stuntman having to go in and save her, and then him catching almost like an illness and going into hospital. It was definitely a troubled production for a very troubled story.
Yeah, no, I remember that was that is a fascinating documentary. Actually, I think the director Michael E. Bryant, who's sort of one of the main guys in that documentary, I always think he's a very interesting contributor on a lot of these documentaries. He's on the direct route for season 8, and he just always has really interesting stories to tell. I find, and certainly was giving all these stories about the mysterious goings on of Wookiee Hole, as you mentioned. I have to say that I do have a soft spot for Revenge of the Cybermen, but purely because I'm 95% sure it's the first ever Classic Who story I watched. I'm pretty certain I think it was like my mum got the VHS out of the library back in like 2006 or something like that. I just always remember the VHS cover of the story, and I just have vivid memories of watching it as a child. So I think kind of I have a soft spot that makes me look past some of the pretty obvious fundamental flaws of this story. That like, you know, the gold and just there's many kind of fundamental flaws, but I like to look past it because it's not all bad. I mean, Charlie, do you enjoy Revenge of the Cybermen?
I think it's in general it's a very flawed story, like you said.
Yes.
But,
Yes.
I think in general it's quite a fun one. I think it's like I think of it as like Time in the Rani, not as bad, but like it's fun if you don't think about it too much.
Yeah, I think to be honest, you can describe a lot of Doctor Who like that.
Yeah.
There's a lot of stories where they're great on the surface. You can really sit back and enjoy it, but if you just try and think a little bit too hard about it, you can kind of spoil it for yourself. So you just got to kind of enjoy it for what it is, and roll with it. I think sometimes.
Well, funnily enough, what you were saying, Ellie, about getting it on VHS, that was ironically enough my first gateway into Revenge of Cybermen. I was at a marketplace and they had this was before the DVD had come out. They had the VHS of Revenge of the Cybermen, and I did manage to buy it, and so I could copy it onto a DVD. And I was actually really excited. I thought, oh, Tom Baker, Cybermen, this is and it's coming after Genesis. This is going to be really exciting. Until I watched the story, and it was kind of a little bit heartbroken.
Yeah.
I mean, it's not the absolute worst Doctor story. They're definitely much worse, but it was just kind of a bit of a disappointment for me, being a huge Cyberman fan and also.
Yeah, no, I get you. I totally get you there. Yeah, I think so. So what else have we got left on season 12 to talk about then? Charlie, have you got any other DVD documentaries that you wanted to pick up on and have a little chat about?
Well, I'm just looking at all my notes.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean,
one
that I remembered, I don't know if you managed to watch this, which was on the Revenge of the Cybermen DVD, was the Checks, Lies and Videotape documentary that I found absolutely fascinating. I watched it on the DVD and again when they released the Blu-ray, which is basically all about fans in the 1980s who used to trade really dodgy VHS copies of Doctor Who episodes for ridiculous amounts of money, trying to get them shipped in from Australia on like a 10th generation copy where you can barely even see what's going on. And it's just that kind of that fascinating, like, you know, you really had to hunt and, you know, go on a discovery to try and watch as much of Doctor Who as you could, because it wasn't just freely available to watch. And these fans would go to ridiculous means to try and, you know, watch an awful copy of Revenge of the Cybermen on a tiny telly where you can barely see or hear what's going on, but you'd love it. You'd love it. And I just loved the kind of passion and enthusiasm of all the contributors on there. That you can just tell how much they loved that sort of time and that experience, I think.
I did really enjoy that documentary. I thought it's just really interesting. Like, I think in a way, as much as I do, you know, really appreciate having all the DVDs available to buy on Amazon and things like that, it just, a part of me wishes that I was part of that and I was one of the ones hunting for all of those copies and like everything. It's really fascinating. I really do enjoy it.
Yeah, 100%. Ryan, what do you want to say?
Well, funny enough, when I was starting collecting Doctor Who, because they hadn't been released yet, I did manage to track a few down on VHS, like 10th Planet, Silver Nemesis, and some of the others. And funny enough, when it came to Destiny of the Daleks, which, funny enough, I ended up having the same experience I had with Revenge of the Cybermen, being sort of disappointed by it, but find it quite an amusing, funny watch nonetheless. I wanted to try and track down the VHS copy, but I couldn't find it anywhere, and it was so ridiculously expensive on eBay, and then back when YouTube first started, they were pretty much uploading all full Doctor Who's onto it, and I did manage to track down Destiny of the Daleks on there. So it's weird how they went from tracking down VHS to basically uploading them on YouTube, but basically in its early days.
Yeah, it was a weird time. I do remember back when Classic Who ended up on YouTube back in the sort of late 2000s and whatnot, when somehow they hadn't all got blocked by that point. Yeah, that was an interesting time. But yeah, as you say, Charlie, I also am kind of that. As brilliant as it is to have all this great stuff and great things to talk about, part of me would love to be sitting there watching this dodgy VHS copy of a of the 10th Planet or something, and just knowing kind of like hardly anybody else has got this and has got the chance to see this, and it feels like something so special and unique, I think. And yeah, I thought it was just a brilliant way to portray that, and so that was definitely one of my favourite documentaries, which, as I mentioned, was originally on the DVD range, but was one of my favourite documentaries that was also included on this Blu-ray as well, I think I would say. The other Blu-ray documentary I wanted to mention, which I kind of left to the end, was the rather unusual and ultimately one-off Doctor Who Times Season 12, which is a fascinating documentary, actually. It essentially takes us back to 1975, which is the year that this season was released, and kind of looks at basically everything that was going on in the world and on television at the time, and is kind of full of archive footage from TV programs that aired around the same time, of news stories and big. I remember there's some mystery of like some MP or something who had disappeared or something, I think, or had died or something like that. And it was a really sort of mysterious story that I ended up researching all this because I was quite fascinated by it, and just kind of taking us through the kind of what was going on in the world and the history around the time of this story with all this archive footage, which I found absolutely fascinating personally. Unfortunately, it's not something they were able to carry on because of essentially it cost too much money to make it. Fundamentally, having to clear the rights for all this footage was just too expensive, and so it was cool because, and you can tell that it was set up to be a running thing, because at the end of it they do a little trail for season 13 and go, oh, in the next edition we'll be looking at this and this, as if it was going to be a regular feature, but sadly not. But Ryan, have you had a chance to watch this, and what did you think of it?
Yeah, I remember watching this when I managed to get the Blu-ray release, and when I watched it, I agree with you. It was a very fascinating, insightful sort of perspective of what was sort of going on at that time. Just basically what was on in politics, on entertainment, basically covering everything. Just what was going on between that space of end of 1974 to mid 75, and it is a shame that they didn't manage to continue with this, because I think it would have been a very interesting recurring series across the classic Blu-ray range. So overall, I thought season 12 was, as the start of this collection, I just thought it was a really good start, and actually got me really excited to know what was coming next. And yeah, just really excited to see what was going to be coming up, and which was surprised because I thought it was going to be a John Pertwee one maybe, but really surprised that they went with Peter Davison afterwards.
Indeed. Well, we'll come on to the reasons why they elect to do season 19 in the next couple of minutes. But Charlie, what as a season, as the stories of season 12, what are your overall thoughts on it?
I think in general, it's a really strong season. I think the only story that I find less than brilliant is probably Revenge of the Cybermen, which we talked about. And in general, even the DVDs, that's a great set of, special features and VAM. It's all really interesting. And when I do get around to buying all of the collection box sets, season 12 is probably one of the first ones on my list after season 8. And I do think it was a really smart choice going with season 12 first, since say they started with season 24 with Time in the Rani and Delta and the Bannermen first. I don't think the collection range would have took off as well, but they started with season 12, the first season of such an iconic Doctor. I think that's what ensured its survival.
Yeah, exactly that. I think that it, as you mentioned, it was a logical choice to go with Tom Baker's first season, a popular season with fans, a season that only has 5 stories in it, so wasn't as much work in many ways for the team to have to produce as much extra content for as many stories. So I think that helped keep it a little bit less of a challenge to start off with. It's also worth noting that all of the kind of episodes existed in their original formats and all that kind of things. There wasn't any money that needed to be spent on restoring the episodes like we had with season 8 and the likes as well. And that's also it connects to part of the reason for season 19, as we come on to, being the second release, because season 19 is notable for the fact that all of the film sequences, so the outdoor location filming, all of them exist in HD, proper film, 60mm film HD, which of course is where Blu-ray comes into its own, because unlike on the DVD where it was only in standard definition, now the Blu-rays gave us an opportunity to actually have this footage in its raw HD quality for the very, very first time, which I think is really cool personally. I know I'm into all that kind of thing, and I think it's great to be able to see the episodes in such stunning definition. But I mean, unfortunately, the kind of drawback of that is you notice more than ever the change between studio and location footage, because it's such high quality, the location footage, when you cut to a studio, you're like, whoa, okay, what happened to the quality there? Whoa. But I think fundamentally having that is a fantastic thing. And so I think that's probably one of the key reasons why they went for this season second, because it was a great selling point. It was able to utilize the sort of HD and the Blu-ray nature of the release, which I think was really, really good. And I don't know, I think Pertwee would have maybe from a popularity point of view been a more obvious choice, but I think that in general, Peter Davison's first season is not unpopular, even if it's maybe not as popular as season 12. I mean, so we got season 19 second up. It was released in December 2018. I think it was announced a couple of months after season 12 was released, and then we had a few months wait before it came out, of course, to close out 2018 with a 7-story box set, so a bit more of a full one with a lot of stuff on there as well. I think it's absolutely ram-packed with content, this one. So we'll come, as we did before, we'll come to you first, Charlie. You've had a chance to watch some of the DVD range sort of features on this, and I know in particular a story like Castrovalva's got a ridiculous amount of special features on it, even on the DVD. The amount of archive footage and appearances of cast and whatever is crazy. But what were sort of the highlights you picked out, Charlie?
Like you were just saying, Castrovalva, I think, had a great set of special features. Even on the DVD, I can just sort of see here, like the amount is just it's huge. My favourite one has got to be where is it? The crowded TARDIS, and it's just explaining the challenges of having a much larger TARDIS crew, since obviously Nyssa was introduced in Keeper of Track, and Adric in Full Circle, and Tegan in Logopolis. So now we have 3 companions, which is a lot more than usual, and I think it just responds to how the writers adapted to having this many companions, which maybe it wasn't for the better. I know, having 3 companions in series 11 and 12 wasn't overly popular. And it's just really interesting to see what they, why they decided to go with that.
Exactly. What about you, Ryan? What are your kind of thoughts on this release in the season 19 Blu-ray?
I mean, I was a little bit surprised, but I think it's mainly because of the fact that I'm not like the world's biggest fan of the Peter Davison era. I like it, but I don't love it. But I do think having to start with season 19, it is definitely Peter Davison's strongest season. And because it does have some strong stories in it, whether it's The Visitation, Kinder, Earthshock, and I think Black Orchid and even Castrovalva are pretty good, but it just I do think it has more good in it than bad, and so in a way I think that's kind of why they went with that season, as well as the fact that they had all that film footage, which I definitely noticed the difference watching on my 4K TV. I definitely noticed the real difference between the film and the videotape studio footage.
Yes, it's quite a big jump. I think that's the only disadvantage we have now of having massive TVs and HD film footage. Whereas if you look at it on season 12, even for example, where the HD film doesn't exist, so even the location scenes are all just upscaled sort of SD, or upscaled from the sort of videotapes. I think it's less of a difference, less of a jump there really. But in terms of season 19 and its various special features, of course the Blu-ray itself in many ways focused on bringing us a lot of making of documentaries, because this is one of the few seasons that was really lacking in making of documentaries in the DVD range, because we didn't have a proper one for Castrovalva, nor for To Doomsday, or Black Orchid, or Time Flight. I don't think there were really at least any good ones on there. They certainly looked to upgrade it. Earthshock did kind of have one, but they have decided to make another one and make a better one, I guess. I don't know. On the new release. So I think that was kind of one of the key focuses of it. And it's notable that they did one for The Visitation back in 2013. I was actually talking to Charlie about this before we started. Was the Visitation Special Edition features a making of documentary that then has its sequel in Black Orchid, and the making of for that we see on this release, where we have what's the chap who plays Turlo? My mind's gone black. Mark Strickson, of course, it's Mark Strickson. How could I forget that? Oh, that's shocking. Who is kind of like the presenter, basically taking Peter Davison, Sarah Sutton, Janet Fielding around the kind of locations of first the Visitation and then of Black Orchid. And it's just a great, I think it's a much more, as we mentioned earlier, it's a much more fun way to do a making of documentary, because it's not just a load of talking heads. You get them to walk around the locations and have a little look at it and a chat about it and their memories of being there and all of those kind of things. I also think that season 19 lends itself to that because of the amount of stories that have a lot of location footage, quite frankly. I know you've got, say, Kinder and Force of Doomsday that are basically studio bound, but you've got Castrovalve, you've got Black Orchid, you've got The Visitation, you've got even Time Flight's got some studio stuff or some location stuff out there. So I think it kind of lended itself to that in that sense. I mean, Ryan, what did you think of some of these new making of documentaries that they put together for this release?
I definitely think they did a good job with some of these documentaries. I think the real highlights were the Castrovalve documentary, the new one for Earthshock, and even Time Flight, because well, with Time Flight, I mean, that is definitely a much worse story. It was, rewatching it again, it was kind of a bit, just wasn't very good, and it was interesting getting that documentary perspective, and it wasn't surprising that it was the very last one to be done of the season. So by that point, the budget virtually was non-existent.
And they thought yet they thought they'd get Concorde as well involved, even though they have no money. It's just
exactly wishful thinking from JNT and Peter Gwyn Wade.
Exactly, yes, it was maybe a little bit optimistic, really, I think. But yeah, as you say, I think that, and I think this is something we might have discussed in our first podcast, was about how for bad stories, often the making of can give you a different perspective on them and a bit more of an understanding of the production problems behind it. And I think for stories like Time Flight, having a great making of documentary is almost more important, I think, than maybe some of the better stories, because you want to understand why it was so bad. And because there's got to be a reason, apart from it was a terrible script or whatever. There's always a load more deep-rooted reasons than that. And so I think, as you mentioned, with a making of like Time Flight, for that story, it just gives such a great insight into the various production problems that there were, really.
Yeah, that reminds me, it's not season 12 or 19, but the way you said about the production problems behind it, I believe there was one in season 7, The Ambassadors of Death, which is generally perceived as a really, really good story. Like, I really enjoy The Ambassadors of Death.
I personally love it. It's one of my favourites,
It's weird though, because that's one of the ones where the production was completely flawed and there was loads of last minute rewrites and everything. And it talks about how it still managed to produce a pretty highly received story. And I think that's the case for not many stories, really.
Yeah, no, exactly. I think Ambassadors of Death, I think it had about 4 different writers or something. It was one of the main problems with it. And then they spent so much money on all those action sequences and stuff that they went way over budget, or something along those lines. But yeah, it shows it's possible to have production problems and a great story. And I think that's covered well in the documentary on that release. But in general, unfortunately, a lot of these stories tend to come out rather on the less good side, and when there's major production problems or often just a lack of money, really, I think it's fair to say. And so I think actually we haven't really mentioned it that much, but let's talk about Behind the Sofa, Ryan, because Behind the Sofa, of course, was introduced in season 12 and continued on in season 19 and all the collection releases. Is it fundamentally a feature you enjoy on these releases?
It's a nice little addition. I wouldn't say it's like the main attraction, because I still think like the new documentaries they put out, the remastering of all the classic stories, I think those two are like the main attraction. For me, Behind the Sofa is just a nice little fun addition to it. Although it's interesting comparing the two, season 12, they had actual costumes and props behind them for that set. But it's interesting, ever since then, probably due to budgetary reasons, it's now just cardboard cutouts, which
indeed,
is definitely something I really notice.
Yeah, exactly.
So another thing where I feel like a lot of the budget was put into the season 12 set with that one-off documentary, the Times documentary, and then the costumes for Behind the Sofa. And I think after that, they were just like, this is going to cost us way too much money. Let's just get rid of the documentary series and let's just have big cardboard cutouts from now on.
Exactly. It's all you need, really, isn't it? Cardboard cutouts will do, as they all turn their heads back every episode going, oh, have we seen that one yet? What do you think that is? I don't know. It's like, it's quite a repetitive part of Behind the Sofa, I have to say. But But I do think, well, personally, I find they work better in their season 19 slightly shorter length, because I know in season 12, and I think they also did it for season 10, they're more like 45 to 50-minute long sort of pieces, whereas in season 19 and in some of the more recent ones, they're much closer to half an hour in length. And I think personally, I feel that works better. I feel like they just drag on a little bit too much if they're closer to an hour. But that half-hour format, I think, keeps the interesting stuff in there, but kind of cuts out some of the kind of just fairly kind of pointless comments they make about the story sometimes.
Yeah, I mean, so far, I think looking at the two sets, I think the highlight has definitely been Tom Baker, Philip Hinchcliffe, and Elizabeth Sladen's daughter, Sadie Miller. I feel like that was the highlight of these two sets so far. I think their perspective has been some of the best of Behind the Sofas so far. Just getting their different perspectives, and how Sadie talking about how her mum felt about making these stories and acting out as Sarah Jane Smith in them, and then of course you have in both sets you have Janet Fielding and Sarah Sutton, the usual double act.
The regulars who turn up on basically every single box set. You can't escape them.
Yeah, and although definitely our regular double act, even though both of them, in my personal opinion, have been the best aspects about the Peter Davison era so far. Yeah. So, and it's so funny hearing how sometimes they look at a classic story and they think, "Oh, I wish we had that in our days," and I wish they had that in the Peter Davison era. And considering how very, for me, mixed in quality the Peter Davison era was, I completely understand and sympathise with them.
Yes, exactly. And I have to say that watching some of the season 19 Behind the Sofas, do you know, someone I feel sorry for is Matthew Waterhouse, who really feels kind of stuck on the side, slightly out of the crew. It very much feels like the Peter Davison and Janet Fielding show, I have to say. And that's not to be critical of it, but I've just watching some of that, it felt like Matthew could hardly get a word in edgeways sometimes. And just like they weren't really paying that much attention to what he was saying. And it felt like he was almost like the real fan going, "Oh, this episode's great. Isn't this great? Oh, I love this." Like he keeps saying how great they all are, but they're kind of all just slagging it off and kind of ignoring what he's saying. And I just felt kind of bad for him, really. I think clearly he's an interesting character. I think there's, that's a fair thing to say. And I think Weekend with Waterhouse is a fantastic documentary, which we'll talk about, I'm sure, in the future, giving a better understanding of him as a person. I'm sure he's a great guy, but it does just feel like he gets a little bit shut out sometimes when all the other three are there. He kind of gets left a little bit on the outside, which I just thought was a little bit of a shame watching it.
Yeah, I do tend to agree. I do think he is definitely a fascinating person to listen to, because he, as I said, he is a fan. He does, and his knowledge about the show is really insightful. Yeah, even if he did end up playing, well, one of my least favorite companions of the show.
I think that's the problem, isn't it? That he really wasn't anybody's favorite companion, yet he likes to think that he was a great companion, which I guess maybe is the challenge there. But I like Matthew. I don't want to be critical of him. I just thought it was a shame that he got a bit quietened sometimes by the other big characters on the screen. Was my sort of just take of it watching it, I thought.
It's a shame, because I do think he is a really good guy, and I just kind of wish he was given a better character to work with. I just feel a bit bad for him. Really do.
Exactly. Okay, so Charlie, what other DVD range features did you pick up? Of course, stuff that anybody can watch on the Blu-rays as well. What did you pick up that you found interesting?
One which I watched actually earlier today was a documentary on Earthshock, my favorite story from season 19, probably. It's called Putting the Shock in Earthshock, and it's basically exploring how they decided to kill off Adric, killing off a companion properly for the first time.
Mm-hmm.
It's just interesting as to how they went about that decision, and it's just really insightful, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a documentary that's still featured on the season 19 box set. Of course, they have since produced a new Earthshock documentary, which I think is meant to be more of a focus on the making of the story itself. As you mentioned, the sort of putting the shock in Earthshock is much more about, as you say, Adric's death, and about the idea behind doing that and how that all came together. and so they kind of, I think, wanted to supplement that with a making of documentary. But I do think that it was a very shocking thing for Doctor Who to kill off a companion. It wasn't really something, it's not really a thing that happens, in Doctor Who. And so I think it was great to talk about that, and how, I think, don't they talk about how they sort of took the opportunity almost with doing it as a complete shock? Was it sort of talked about beforehand? I can't quite remember. It's been a while since I've watched that.
I think they were saying like it. No one really anticipated it. It was just very out of the blue. I think they actually made the decision, like more or less during filming. I think, which is slightly insane, really. Like they just told Matthew Waterhouse, "We're killing your character," and that was it. Yeah.
Yeah, and I mean, I imagine he didn't really want to leave that much because he was a pretty big fan of Doctor Who, and he thought his character was brill and he loved it. And so I can't imagine he would have loved being told your character's being killed at the end of the story and you will no longer be required come the end of Earthshock. It's must have been a bit of a shame for him, really, I think.
Well, funnily enough, I think it was on the Peter Davison conversation with Matthew Sweet. I think it was that he said that JNT was planning on getting rid of Nyssa first, but Peter Davison was like, "No, please don't get rid of Nyssa because she's my favorite of the three companions because she's so bright and intellectual. We need to have her on board." And so I think it was sort of, we were like, "Well, who we're going to get rid of first then?" And it's like, well, it was going to be Adric in the end, unfortunately.
Yeah, they couldn't get rid of Tegan. Like, I think Tegan's generally perceived as the most, the most likable companion out of the three.
Yeah, I'd say so. Yeah, exactly. I mean, I think maybe because Adric got kind of not forced out, in Matthew Walton didn't get forced out, but maybe that's why he's never had quite such a close relationship to the group that the other three sort of seem to have, is maybe because he was kind of killed off out of it in that sense back in Earthshock as well, which is pretty notable, I think it's fair to say. So what other stuff have we got for season 19? I think season 19 is notable for having loads of studio footage, if that's your thing, which I stick it on in the background when I'm doing other stuff. I stick the studio footage on because there's blooming hours of it on there. I think there's about 3 hours for Castrovalva and a couple of hours for Earthshock, and I can't remember. I think Forward to Doomsday's got an hour and a half or something. It's not as much as what we get towards the later seasons. I think season 24 coming out soon's got like 25 hours of studio footage for 4 stories or something stupid like that. So if you like studio footage, then that's your thing. I mean, do you guys ever stick the studio footage on, or is it not really quite your thing so much?
For me, then, the studio footage, it's quite nice to have on in the background, but it's never something that I'd sit and watch actively, because it feels like not so much anymore, but like it used to be, if you've seen one studio footage, you've kind of seen them all in a way.
Yeah. Exactly.
I completely agree. Oh, sorry, you go.
No, go for it, Ryan.
It was I completely agree with both of you. Although one bit in the season 19 studio footage was really amusing, was the bit in Castrovalva where he was invited to that dinner table and he gets the stick of celery and he's like, definitely civilization, and he takes the bite of it, and then it's like, cut, and then he just has this really annoyed grimace look on his face.
Because he hates the celery. Yep, exactly that. Yeah, no, that was definitely an entertaining moment, and I think that's what they did on the DVD range, wasn't it? They kind of did the highlights of studio footage rather than just the whole thing. But now they've just gone, we've got so much storage on these discs, let's just chuck it all on there, whatever. And I kind of like that. I'm kind of like, it's nice for a completist fan. But also, there is lots of long periods where it is just them going through and filming the show and nothing's really going wrong, or there's not really any jokes. It's kind of just, it's interesting. But as you say, Charlie, once you've seen one, you've kind of seen it all. It's very much the same format every single time because that's just how you make TV back then. So, yeah, I definitely wouldn't want them to not put it on there because I do think that it has merit, and there's definitely people out there who really enjoy it. But for me, it's, as you mentioned, Charlie, very much background viewing, if nothing else, I think.
I think it would be interesting if we got to see studio footage from season 1 or 2, because obviously back then they filmed it really differently, so they probably don't have any studio footage. But say they did, I think that'd be really interesting to watch, I think.
Yeah, exactly. I think, unfortunately, as you mentioned it, I think it is the case that none of it exists, simply. I think the earliest one that I'm aware of is Claws of Axos, which has an hour and a quarter of studio footage, which is on the DVD and is on the Blu-ray. I think that's the earliest sort of behind-the-scenes filming in a sort of substantial studio stuff that I've ever seen. I don't know if there is some lurking from the 60s era somewhere, but that is a fascinating insight. And seeing Roger Delgado sort of in footage of him not in character, which is actually a real rarity, really, it's just really cool to see as well, I find. And John Pertwee getting a bit angry at somebody, I think, as well, who's getting in his eye line or something while they're making that story, which is always funny to watch and to see, really, there. But yeah, so just to cover off some of the other features we have for season 19, they did the 5.1 audio mix, is my favourite thing, for Kinder and Earthshock. I mean, Kinder's got a cracking soundtrack, so I definitely right decision there. It's just wacky, a bit crazy, a bit confusing, a bit bonkers, but I think exploring the sort of, using sound and using that 5.1 opportunity with it, I think was a great idea. And Earthshock as well has actually got a brilliant score, so I think that was also a very much a good decision there. As I think you briefly mentioned, Ryan, they've also got another one of these in conversation interviews with Peter Davison that Matthew Sweet did. What was your kind of take on that, Ryan, that interview? Was it better, more interesting or not than the Tom Baker one?
Well, I mean, it was still definitely interesting. I mean, even though Peter Davison has never been one of my favourite doctors, it was really fascinating just sort of hearing his perspective about how he sort of became involved with the show, about how he admitted that he kind of struggled a bit with sort of his characterization of the Doctor, which probably led to the fact that there were different script editors in his first season. I think there were like 3 different script editors, and the choice behind the cricketing outfit and how much input he had into it, and talking about how he had his sort of big first convention experience even before his first episode even went out. So it was just a bit crazy at the time of his announcement as the Doctor, and he was only 29 when he took on the part.
Exactly, yeah, he certainly was. Well, of course, the youngest Doctor at the time, and until we got Matt Smith, he was the youngest one there. I think that with that interview, it's nice to see Peter kind of opening up a bit more, because I feel like he has a tendency to be quite kind of just critical of his own stuff. He kind of just sits there and slags it off and says, "Oh, well, that looks a bit awful. Yeah, that was a bit of a rubbish script. It's not very good. Oh, look at my acting. It was a bit awful." Like you kind of get that. Obviously, we watch and study all these documentaries with interviewing so many different cast members from across the show's history, and I think there's a few of them, like as we discussed with Peter, who just kind of are a little bit critical of their own material. I think Janet's a little bit like that as well at times. But and so maybe get them together sometimes it can be a bit of a, this is awful fest. Particularly I think they did like the Boom Behind the Sofa and Force to Doomsday. They weren't the most positive about. I haven't actually managed to get around to watching the Time Flight Behind the Sofa in time, but I'm not expecting that to be a particularly positive review. But so I think ultimately it's just nice when you doing that interview with Peter Davison, just give him a bit more opportunity to offer more interesting opinions than just, it's not very good.
Yeah, I mean, for what I've always gathered with Peter Davison, the recurring thing with him is that he always views Case of Androzani as the highlight of his Doctor career, while the absolute worst one he always says is Time Flight. He always brings it up as the worst story he's ever done, which I can't really blame him considering how just not very good it was. I'm afraid that's all I had to say.
I was just going to say, I absolutely agree. Like Time Flight, Arc of Infinity, honestly, lots of season 20, I do think he's very right to be critical of, but like season 19, lots of season 21, where I think his era really picks up, I think he's a bit too overcritical of, like Resurrection of the Daleks, Planet of Fire. I do really like season 21 as well as 19, and they're both quite really good.
Yeah, I agree with you. I mean, last season 21 is really good. I mean, it's a shame that it had to start off with Warriors of the Deep, which is, well, personally for me, is my least favourite Doctor Who story of all time. And I'm very interested to see if they'll do any new behind-the-scenes documentaries with that, or maybe
that's true.
Keep the same ones from the DVD. I mean, the ones they had on the DVD were pretty in-depth about why the story just did not work at all. I think that was really fascinating, just diving to just the chaotic production schedule of it.
Yeah, 100%. I think I can't remember who actually said it. Maybe it even was Peter himself, but somebody said that if season 21 had been Peter Davison's second season, he might have stayed for a fourth season, because he made his decision was it Peter who said that? Because with season 20, it was awful, and he was like, "No, I don't need this anymore. I'm going to leave." But actually, if it had been really good and he'd really enjoyed it, maybe he would have stuck with it further, which I think would have been, interesting for the show as well, where it would have taken it if that was the case. But I just think that's quite a sort of fascinating insight, really, isn't it, into his sort of thought process, and that kind of fact that his perception of the quality of the show did significantly affect his decision on whether he wanted to stay on. Because you often get that impression that, it's kind of like just the actor's decision, like, oh yeah, I just feel like I want to move on now. It's the right time. Not necessarily to do with the actual quality of the writing or of the show itself. But he's basically said that it was because it was awful for a season that I left, which I just found quite interesting personally.
Well, I think it's a bit of a shame because I think season 20 does have some pretty good stories. I mean, I think Mordred Undead and
yeah, that's true.
Snake Dance are pretty good. Enlightenment, I think, is one of the
Yeah.
very best of the 80s Doctor Who. And of course, Five Doctors is.
Well, yes, indeed.
I mean, it is a pretty good story, the Five Doctors. So,
yes.
I mean, it's a shame because I do think there are some gems in season 20, but I think it was sort of because the fact that he had his chance encounter with Patrick Troughton, who of course told him to do just 3 years and then get out. I think that just sort of enforced his decision to leave. I think the writing was on the wall after that encounter.
Yeah.
And it was very interesting that he said that he was very proud of his decision to leave, but it was really hard for him on his last day of filming.
Yeah.
Just seeing Colin Baker turning up in his outfit is just like, well, that's me done, I guess. And he said that David Tennant had the exact same experience when he did The End of Time, when he saw Matt Smith basically come on to set. It was sort of that feeling of, well, there's nothing more you can do now. Your time's up.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I think it's always must be such a weird moment when somebody's coming to replace you, basically, in your role that you've held on TV as the sort of lead character, and then somebody turns up to replace you. It must be a weird feeling, I'm sure, for all these different Doctors. So season 19 as a whole, what are your guys' kind of final perspectives, opinions on it, and the releases and the documentaries as well? Charlie, what about you?
In general, yeah, it's a good season overall. Overall, probably maybe a 7.5 or 8 out of 10.
Yeah.
It's got more good than bad. A couple of ones like a Forced Doomsday, Time Flight, I think they're the worst. But in general, it's a very good series. I really do quite like it, and yeah, I think I'm not going to be rushing to get the collection box set when I do go around to get them.
Yeah.
Like, I'll be prioritizing seasons 8 and 14 and 2023 probably. I really like season 23, but this isn't the time to talk about that.
We'll talk about it later, but Trial of Time Lord, we'll talk about it another day, but it's great.
Yeah, and yeah, but I'll still probably end up getting it at some point.
Yeah, Ryan, what about you? Season 19, good memories?
Yeah, I mean, even though it isn't one of my personal favorite seasons of Doctor Who, I do think, as Charlie rightfully says, there is definitely more good in it than bad, and I do think they did such a good job of with all the new features they've done, all the different extras. As you said, the new surround sound for some of the stories have been really good. Just hearing it on my audio setup with my 4K TV, I definitely can tell the difference. And I definitely think they did such a good job with this set. Definitely, absolutely.
Yeah, 100%. I think it's. I feel like looking at these first two sort of releases, that they're great and they are really good, but I think that they were maybe slightly less ambitious than some of the stuff we got more recently. Like all the new documentaries are mostly making of documentaries or fairly straightforward documentaries in that sense. Whereas when you look to say even season 8 on the most recent one, where you have a really nice feature about Terrance Dicks. You've got the direct route, which I think is fascinating. The Devil's Weekend, Revisit to Allborn. I think that they were probably figuring out what they're doing a little bit, and so they didn't want to do anything too extravagant. Like, it's not to play it down at all, because there's some great new stuff on there. I really enjoyed the making of a Black Orchid. The new one for Castrovalva was fascinating as well. There's some really good stuff on there. I just think that made that over the sort of 9 box sets I think we've got so far, that it's kind of they've kind of been more adventurous and more risky and done a few more different things, which I think is always really, really nice as they develop. And so I guess you can kind of look back at these and go, they're kind of, not that they're really any worse than any of the other releases, just that they're maybe a little bit less adventurous in some aspects than what we've had more recently, would probably be a good way to surmise it, maybe. And so just to kind of, for anybody who's not fully aware of exactly what's going on with these re-releases. So essentially, they decided they want to re-release them because they were limited originally, and now you can't get the limited edition ones anymore. You can't buy them. Well, you can off eBay if you've got 200 quid spare, maybe, but otherwise, no. So they realised people actually still want them, even though they're 200 quid on eBay. So let's release them in normal packaging. So you can get them in a standard Blu-ray sort of box set packaging, and with all the same discs, content, features, everything exactly the same. The only other different thing I believe is the booklet, the little booklets that come with every single release they're shortened for whatever reason. I don't really know how, but I think they must maybe only have the sort of contents of each disc rather than the kind of background information, sort of long notes about each story that they do with the limited edition one. So I guess if you're bothered about that, then you've got to try and seek out the limited edition ones. But I wouldn't spend an extra 100 quid just to get an extra 12 pages in the booklet. It's not worth it. It's my opinion. But then I have it, so maybe I'm biased. I don't know. Maybe if I was in someone else's position, I would be different. But that's just my perspective on it. So that brings us to a close really for our discussion on season 12 and 19 today. We're nearly at the end of today's podcast, but of course we always wrap up by discussing any upcoming releases. And so today is the day for season 12 and 19, the re-releases. June 21st. It's also worth noting we finally got an announcement of a release date for season 24, which is June the 21st. So only 3 weeks or so to go. Of course, also the UK's Freedom Day, where supposedly all COVID restrictions are going to be dropped. So I don't know, maybe I could go outside on that day, but I won't because I've got season 24 to watch. I don't know. Ryan, are you going to be watching season 24 on that day?
Well, yeah, definitely. I mean, hopefully, if it arrives perfectly fine in the post, then I'm definitely going to be checking it out. I mean, yeah, season 24 is a very surprising season to choose, but I'm definitely excited. It's mainly for Delta and the Bannerman because the new stuff they got for that, which it's a story, as I said many times before, I know it's not very good, but yet I strangely love it because of how weird and bizarre it is. It just feels like this weird mishmash of Doctor Who meets Grease meets Heidi Eye. It's such a weird story, but
it's an interesting
it's a guilty
one.
pleasure for mine.
No, absolutely, it's great. I mean, they're going to have to tackle the less popular ones at points, and I think today, the day we record it, in DWM they put the in-depth breakdown of everything that's on the box set, and it's ridiculous how much content's on there. We're going to do in a couple of weeks, we're going to do a proper preview podcast of this release, where we're really going to break down everything that there is everything to look forward to for this release, because it's bonkers how much stuff is on there. So we won't go into that now. We'll save that for next time. But it's fair to say they've realised that the stories aren't that great, so we've probably got to cover it in lots of very nice other stuff to get people to buy it, essentially. I think that's the route they've gone down there. So just to wrap up, we've also got announced today as we record, so a couple of days ago, was that on July the 5th they're going to be re-releasing season 10 and season 18, which were the next two collection range releases back in 2019, I think early 2019, both those were, and so we're going to get both those released in the standard packaging on the 5th of July, and we're going to try and at some point before then or on that day do a podcast covering those releases as well, because I think there's lots of great stuff to talk about there. And what I feel like is becoming a recurring way to end is still the Web of Fear. It's still there. Still don't know when it's going to be released. It's been 7 months and we haven't heard anything. Charlie, you still looking forward to this, or have you kind of just got a bit bored of it by now?
I'm still looking forward to it. I'm going to get the Web of Fear special edition. But they need to release something else because people are going to forget about it.
Yeah, or even just another trailer or a rough release date. Say I don't know, November 2021 or something. Just give us something to work with. It's a bit of a challenge, isn't it? Really, as we come towards this point. But I'm sure at some day in the future it will get released, and you never know, they might even announce another one at some point. But if we're really lucky.
I'm just hoping it's not another Underwater Menace situation. I'm really hoping it's not that.
Yes, and after last time where we discovered that there's no information on the internet about the animation company behind it, it's slightly concerning. So I don't know, we'll see. But I believe Gary Russell, who's one of the executive producers on that release, in his Twitter bio mentions the fact that he's animating Yeti's Underground or something. So he at least is still involved in it in some capacity. So hopefully we'll get it soon. We'll hopefully get it soon. But there we go. That has been this edition of KerVAM. So thank you, Ryan and Charlie. Have you guys enjoyed having a little chat about season 12 and 19 today?
Yeah, it was definitely very insightful conversation we've just had. Wouldn't you agree, Charlie?
Yeah, absolutely. It's been really enjoyable talking about these, especially as I don't even have season 12 and 19, and I still managed to say a few things,
Yeah, absolutely. I think in many ways that just reminds us how much good stuff the DVD range did bring us, how much good content there was way back then. Even these releases that came out 15 years ago, there's still great documentaries that hold up to this day to be able to be thoroughly enjoyable. And that's something we'll focus on down the line as well. We'll have a much more of a deep chat about the DVD range and some of the great things of that. But that's, of course, for another podcast. So as I mentioned, we're going to be doing a season 24 preview podcast, hopefully in 2 weeks' time, so a little bit sooner than normal for the podcast, where we're going to just look through that crazy breakdown that GWM gave us, have a little discussion on what these things might mean, some of the slightly more cryptic titles of documentaries and whatnot, what we hope to expect from them. We're going to tackle all of that in a podcast in a couple of weeks' time. And then a couple of weeks after that, we will be here to discuss everything that happened in it and what we thought of it after it's been released as well. So I hope you all have very much enjoyed KerVAM. As always, please go and follow us on Twitter at KerVAM at KerVAM Pod. I should really get our Twitter name right. You also now can listen to us on Spotify, on Apple Podcasts. I think you're on Acast as well, and of course on my YouTube channel, EMS Productions. But apart from that, I hope you guys have enjoyed KerVAM, and we'll be back again for a brand new episode very, very soon. Goodbye!